Dr. Lepofsky is a professor of archaeology at Simon Fraser University, where she has been since 1995. Diana's primary interest is the social and ecological impacts of past human interactions with the environment. And she works primarily on the Northwest Coast in the traditional territories and in collaborations with numerous, at least several or quite a number of First Nations. The research program of Diane's has been strengthened considerably by her association with archaeologists, paleo and neo-ecologists, geomorphologists, but most importantly, with First Nations traditional knowledge. I think two things which I would like to mention that Diana did is kind of a changing a paradigm, how important other groups of organisms for the First Nations in traditional as a food source compared to salmon, for example. We all know that salmon is important, but what she did, she actually changed, moved the needle to introduce that herring is as important and clams are very important. So in this role, she was a coordinator of the herring school. That's where our paths crossed, and Clam Garden Network. So she actually put this on the table that there are two culturally important species of indigenous people, not only salmon, but also herring and clams. And keystone species have always played a central role in food security and food sovereignty, and that ability to sustain, harvest, and eat these foods is linked to a range of issues, including cultural identity, governance, and emotional and physical health. At this point, I would like to please join me in welcoming Diane Lepofsky as she discusses the Clam Garden Network, exploring the social ecological context of clam management of the past, present, and the future. Thank you. Okay, welcome, Diane.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see some faces out there of my friends and mentors, you guys. And I wish we could be in person, but I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Actually, I'm talking to you from Skeety Island, where I live, I guess, most of my time this year, since March anyway. And it's really, it feels really right to me to be talking about these kinds of issues because it's about food security, food sovereignty, community, and being place-based, which is very much something you think about if you're living on an island, and very much something that you think about if you're connected to your heritage, no matter what that is. So thank you for this opportunity. And I just want to also say that although I'm up here talking, really you should imagine the whole cohort of my teachers and friends and mentors behind me, Sky Augustine for sure, and Anne Solomon, and just a whole range of people whose pictures you'll see who make up the network. I just happen to be the spokesperson at the moment. And because I'm an archaeologist, the story that I'm going to tell you is a little more archaeological or deep time kind of in its focus, but very much hopefully grounded in the present and the future. And I also want to start as well with acknowledging all those mentors and teachers in my life. Really, who I am, what I know, what I share is entirely 100% the result of the privilege that I've had of working with elders, youth, managers, scientists, just a range of people from a whole range of contexts, of communities. And I would particularly want to take a moment to acknowledge my friends in Slayaman and in Bella Bella, the Tla'amin people and the Heiltsuk people who are among my greatest teachers and friends in this journey around Clam Gardens and other journeys, because communities are in lockdown today, because they both have discovered multiple cases of COVID in their communities as of yesterday. So I'd like us all collectively to put our good thoughts and wishes to them and to Squamish and to the other communities all over the world who are trying to figure out how to connect with community, connect with place, connect with self during these times. So, I'm just thinking, yeah. So really, why does it matter? Why are we talking about these issues? Why are we talking about clam gardens? Why are we talking about traditional management? And this is something that Nigel Hagen, who I'm so excited to see Nigel's lovely face in the collection there of faces, who've been talking about it for decades. You know, why is it important to talk about traditional management in the context of Western management and Western science? And you guys all know that really there has been this kind of paradigm of wilderness around the world, not just in British Columbia, where Western scientists, managers, newcomers, settlers saw what they saw what the land that they were looking at as basically empty, wild. There was no kind of impact connection with any other people. And of course, it made it easier for people then to move in. So just moving closer to home, if you look at these kind of two landscapes here, I think, you know, wilderness would be a term that would have been used for them for a long time. The one on the left, Nigel might recognize, this is Hoyt up in Heiltsuk territory. And what you're looking at, beautiful wild landscape, is you're looking at a berry garden in the foreground and a 3,000-year-old village site, and a root garden and culturally modified trees and a fortified site and a clam garden in the distance. So it's anything but a wild landscape. This entire landscape has been managed, lived in, connected to over the generations. And likewise, this beach, this kind of posed Curtis photo of the clam digger, you know, we can think about this as being a managed beach. And though there are no tangible evidence of that management that people could see, we should be thinking about these landscapes as managed over time. And it's just the onus on us, who maybe aren't from this place, to think about what would be the evidence for that management. It might not be in your face. And in both these images, it's not. But we need to start having our starting place being, this is a managed landscape, not a wild landscape. How might we find evidence for that? These conversations are so current because this is a paper that came out, Nature Sustainability, in January of 2020, basically by Oswald et al., looking at the fire record in back eastern US, New England. And they decided, based on their records, their methods, that indigenous peoples there were not managers, did not have an impact. And they made some really kind of bold statements, I think, to be provocative, which of course the press completely went wild with headlines like indigenous people did not manage the forest and things like that. So I and several of my colleagues wrote a comment about it to Nature. And they rejected our comment because we weren't introducing any new data, because traditional knowledge, which is what we do talk about in the paper, is not considered data. It's not considered on par. So the only responses to this article that they were willing to publish were ones that had like more pollen data or more Western science data. So this conversation is very current and has really, really serious implications for a whole range of social and ecological contexts today. So moving closer to home, some of you have seen this graph before. I really like this because this is kind of graphically shows the management continuum on the Northwest coast and the kind of evidence that's easy to find with archaeological record and some that's not. So if these on the left-hand side are kind of the standard management practices that indigenous peoples used all over the world. So this is just Northwest coast as an example. But here we have ethnographic evidence for those management practices being applied from the mountaintops to the ocean floor. And that's what these small cross hatchings are, not the bold ones. But then we have the archaeological evidence, which is the bolded evidence. And you can see that there's kind of non-overlapping evidence between the archaeological and the oral historical and the interview data, the ethnographic data. And this to me tells us that we really need to be thinking about multiple ways of knowing and multiple kinds of evidence to get at these management practices. Otherwise, we're going to keep reaffirming that paradigm of that wilderness that you saw in the previous images. So today we're going to focus on the ocean, which is appropriate for you guys. But really thinking about this, all this is transferable to other systems as well. So in the Clam Garden Network, we recognize that talking about ancient mariculture is kind of just one avenue of getting at all these larger social and ecological issues. It's just a whole range of them. And really any of these we could explore in quite a bit of detail. But really this is our access point. But when you think about traditional knowledge, it's so embedded and integrated and interwoven that it's kind of arbitrary where you start your study, because no matter where you start, you'll end up in that fabulous web of knowledge and connection over time and space. So to get at that web of knowledge, the network is this kind of loosely formed group of people. It really is just kind of an email list, and people come and go out of it as they like, that come from all kinds of backgrounds, you know, from academic communities, from First Nations communities, from managerial communities, from the general public, and all of whom recognize the importance of bringing together knowledge. And, you know, I was doing an interview yesterday for somebody, and they asked what changes I've seen in my career over the 30 years. And this is one significant change that, you know, that I think we should acknowledge and feel good about, is that integration of knowledge, true integration of knowledge, is starting to become more and more commonplace. Not in all avenues, and certainly not in all countries of the world, not all places in BC for sure. But it's a real shift over, you know, when I started this 30 years ago and to today, that people are asking, what are multiple ways of knowing? How can we bring those knowledge together? How can we be mutually respectful? So that feels good, actually. And it's nice to have something to feel good about. So let's embrace that. We're going to talk today just about Quadra Island, which is this area in red here. And it's not very far, it's just north of where I'm talking to you from. But there's clam gardens, of course, up and down the coast from Alaska, documented in the ethnographic record in Washington, yet to be found. But I'm sure they're there or were there. But we're just going to focus on this one place as an example of the many places where we could be talking about. We have this, this is kind of the many people, some of the many people involved in the network, and really I should redo this slide and add many, many more folks. There's Sky, who's in the lower corner here, and Solomon, who you hear about, John Harper and Mary Orris. And this beautiful, beautiful logo, I love this logo, that was actually produced by Sky's sister, fabulous artist. I just put it right in the center just to give her some advertisement, fabulous work. So again, we're going to focus mostly on the archaeology and paleoecology today, but I just want to, you know, give some very quick grounding into kind of clam management. We're talking about clam gardens, these rock-walled features that I think most of you know what they are. But just to remember again that that's a visible, tangible version of all the management practices that happened over the millennia that are less obvious. And what's so cool about clam gardens is that naysayers cannot deny them. People who would have said, and might still say, that the foreshores were not managed, show me the evidence. Clam gardens are in your face. You can't deny it. But there's all these other more subtle things that we're interested in getting at that we hear about through interviews, talking with elders, like Nicole is doing up here in Healthsick Country with Emma and Tony Reed. So people talk about adding sediment, doing size selection. They talk about timing restrictions. They talk about restrictions in terms of location. People share knowledge about how to harvest and process. They talk about changes, of course, and all those practices today. And one thing to think about, and you know, Sky's work really brings us to the fore, is the importance of clam digging and some of these actions for kind of solidifying community and intergenerational connections. If any of you have been to sewing bees or gone clam collecting yourself or berry collecting, any of those kind of quiet actions that have your hands moving are really amazing for sharing and bonding. And I think that that's an important part of the management story that's very different when it's those people doing the managing that are connected to each other and to place than if you're managing in Ottawa, when you've never been there and you maybe have never even seen a live clam in your life. So just something to think about going forward in terms of kind of what we're looking at. So I can't ask for a show of hands, but I suspect that most of you know what a clam garden is by now, but these are these rock wall features that are created by rolling rocks down slope and taking an otherwise slanted beach and making it flat by the building of this beautiful rock wall. And this is my friend, I think this is, oh, maybe this is Amy Grosbeck, on one of the beautiful clam gardens in Quadra Island. You can see this pancake flat terrace that's created over time. And we have some information now about how long it takes actually to fill in those terraces and to make them. We know that in fact there is 3 kinds of, or kind of morphologies of clam gardens now, and that each of them have different kind of ecological contexts that would have affected, influenced how people interacted with them and how productive they were in the past. So we have clam gardens that were built on beaches that were already productive, soft sediment clam beaches, like this one here. So there's sand underneath the sand. We have this one that was built on bedrock, so there was no beach before at all. So there's only bedrock under the sand. And this one that was built is built on rolling rocks down these steep eroding bedrock shorelines. So again, no sand, just bedrock and boulders underneath the sand of the clam garden. So in these 2 cases, the bedrock and the shorelines and the bedrock shelves, there was no clam habitat prior. So when we're thinking about clam management and augmenting clam habitat through time and feeding people, these 2 kinds of clam gardens are a really important part of the equation. And we'll come back to that in a sec. So it's taken me about 6 years to come up with a figure that I like that actually shows clam garden, how clam gardens are constructed. So this is my latest iteration. And I thank my friend Louise Williams for helping me with this. But the 2 main clam species that are kind of the target, we know from the archaeological sites and from talking to people, but are the target for clam gardens are little neck clams and butter clams, and they dominate the archaeological record. We get other species as well, but it's mostly these 2. We know that these 2 species have very specific tidal ranges. So we know that little neck has a wide tidal range. It flourishes from 2.3 meters to 0.5 meters above sea level, though they continue lower, but this is really their happy place. And butter clams have a much more restricted zone. But remember that they're only like to go down about 30 centimeters. So it's a strip that we're talking about in this zone where these clams flourish on these natural beaches, okay? So you can imagine collecting on these beaches, and you can imagine that, you know, you go up here if you want little necks or anywhere, and you go down here if you want butters, and you have some zone here where at the lowest tide where you wouldn't really bother to go necessarily. You build a clam garden, and eventually this wall fills in with sediment over time, and we know from our studies it can take hundreds or thousands of years. You can see what happens to the little neck and butter clam habitat. Basically, in a beach that already exists, you don't actually increase the amount of habitat of those 2 species in most soft sediment beaches. So it's really the same amount of green and yellow as it was before. But what you get is that in these moderate tides, you still have tons of access to productive beach that you didn't have before. So remember, before you only got it at the lowest low tides. Now you get it at these moderate beaches. You get much more beach exposed. But in the bedrock and the slope boulder situations, remember there's no clam habitat before. So you have increased your habitat, your production, manyfold, basically from 0 to 100, okay? So looking at Quadra, you know, we went to work at Quadra because there were so many clam gardens, and it was really, I love thinking about this text that Anne wrote me when she left working. We were working in Slam, and we only found a couple clam gardens, but we were kind of, there weren't as many, and we didn't understand why at that time as much. So Anne left and went to see her family on Quadra, and she wrote a text. She was so excited. She said, I love these calm gardens. And I think about it every time. So we have calm gardens and we have clam gardens. And these are all the calm gardens, and in Quadra, all those little blue dots are the clam gardens. The yellow dots are some of the major villages that would have been supported by those clam gardens, the archaeological sites. And the red ones are some of our sampling sites, which we'll talk about later. Now, we went to Quadra because there were so many clam gardens, and we thought that it would be great for ecological experiments. We could have, you know, positive and negative places. The truth is, it was actually it's hard to find a beach on Quadra that doesn't have a clam garden. And that means that it's actually harder to find controls than we thought. But it's not true for other parts of the coast. It's really a kind of a social and ecological question of why there are clam gardens some places and not others. There are tons of them here on Quadra. And this looks a lot like the Broughton Archipelago, where Chief Adam Dick Quaxistala was raised and built clam gardens himself. These are just some pretty shots I wanted to share with you of clam gardens. This one here in the upper left is on a soft sediment beach. These here on these islands were actually boulder fields, but you can see them really clearly in the drone photographs by Keith Holmes. This is another soft sediment beach, but look at this cool photo. Look at how our boat fits perfectly in the canoe landing. Isn't that neat? I love this shot. This is a very wonderful beach where we found 11,500-year-old clams below the clam garden, which I'll talk about later. So if you've heard me talk before, you've seen this video. I love this video. I make my family watch it multiple times. I could watch it all day because it totally reflects my life. And if you worked on a clam garden, Sky, I know, will agree with me. This is what it's like. There's the flat. There's the wall. You can see the wall. You can see us working away. And now it's gone. So that lovely video is by Mark Wunsch and Green Coast Media, but it really reflects really what it's like doing work on these things because they're mostly below the tides. For an archaeologist who digs into the water, and the water has to be far from the hole, otherwise you can't see what you're doing. We have about 5 days a month for 4 months of the summer, and 3 hours on those days to actually do our field work. So it is just like being in a time-lapse video. It's totally fun. It's chaotic. All the pictures of me on clam gardens, I'm just covered from head to toe with mud, and my kids are embarrassed. So these are the kinds of things that we've asked on Quadra about clam gardens. And we actually know a lot, I think now, or more than we did. And when I came and talked to the fisheries group like 6-7 years ago with Nicole Smith, one of my collaborators, we were just starting. And so it's really neat for me to see kind of where we've come thanks to all the work in the network. So we can ask, how much habitat do clam gardens create by building those walls on bedrock and soft sediment beaches? How productive were they in the past and today? Why are they more productive if they are? How old are they? What is their social and ecological role in the past and today? So I want to talk about each of these things. So how much habitat was created? Well, thanks to my friends Keith Holm and Jacob Earnshaw and Ginevra Toniello, we just did this kind of really cool project where we went in the field and basically counted where every clam garden is in Quadra, and also kind of did, using air photos and GIS, measured the amount of terrace that was created by those clam gardens, and then asked what is their substrate. So in a clam garden that already had soft sediment underneath, nothing is created by adding the clam garden. It might be better, just is not more, but if there's bedrock or boulders underneath, you're adding more beach. So in total, 15 kilometers of wall, over a third of the shoreline in Quadra is covered in a clam garden. That's incredible. And if you think about that, would otherwise be called wilderness, no way. And that is about 11 hectares of clam habitat in this area, and over a third of that was fully created. So that means over a third of the 11 hectares were fully created by people building clam gardens. So think about food security and food sovereignty, huge. They've basically increased in the past food production many, many fold over what nature had to offer. So we tackled these questions of how productive are they and what influences clam growth experimentally. And Anne Solomon, who you see here on the right, leads the charge in this. And Anne, well, if you guys all know Anne, she's just a wonderful person, a wonderful scholar, and really, of her many intellectual strengths, experimental design is one of them. So this is actually her doing work in Health Country with Julia Jackley, her student and my student. And I'm not going to talk about Anne's work as, in specific, but just in general to talk about kind of what we know from those experiments, looking at clam beaches today. So how productive are clam beaches today with clam gardens versus those that don't have walls? And then we can roll that question back in time, how productive were they in the past with and without a clam garden wall? So we know from doing surveys and experiments, and this is a study that Amy Grosbeck, Anne's and my student, led in 2014, and published in PLOS, I think, that clam gardens are basically flatter, and so they increase the best habitat, as you saw, but I think it's really they increase the access to that best habitat, like we saw in that diagram. But from surveys and scientific and experiments and exclusions, we know that they have much greater productivity in clam gardens than non-walled beaches, especially the young ones. And this is something we'll come back to when we talk about the archaeological and paleoecological record. We see the same thing, that the young ones are most affected by some of the kind of variable conditions in clam gardens and non-walled beaches. And that clams and clam gardens have higher growth rates, they survive better, and again, it matters most for the young. And this makes sense, like if you're trying to have a healthy population, it's the young you want to focus on. So if you can create conditions that are good for young, you're going to have a more sustainable food source. And in the end, Amy was able to figure out that these clam gardens are many, many % more productive than non-walled beaches. So that's today. And that's cool because I would argue, and I'm going to argue, that the beaches today are not as productive as in the past. So if that's true, and non-walled beaches are this much less productive than clam gardens in today's circumstances, which are less than optimal, imagine how much more productive they were in the past when people were tending them and taking care of them. Through Natasha Salter's work, her master's degree in REM, and Natasha's working up this as a paper, she was able to kind of address why do they do better in clam gardens than outside of clam gardens. And Natasha and her team looked at several variables, water flow, the gravels and the silts, the temperatures and the organic carbons, and they did, again, experiments and surveys by adding carbon, by doing exclusion. And they found that especially the stabilizing of the temperatures and the addition of the organic carbon were huge in promoting growth of clams and clam gardens. So having that wall, and this is something I remember from the first time I was in the field, and I took Anne to SLAM, and that first day, she hypothesized that in clam gardens, there's going to be a narrower temperature range, not too hot, not too cold, that would help the clams flourish. And she was right. And also we wonder right away, if you go to a clam garden, they're full of broken up shell, mostly barnacles. How does that affect productivity? And they were able to show by adding broken up shell that clams and clam gardens with this increased broken shell do better than non-walled beaches. Now, in the past, I'm not sure if there was as much broken shell. I think that's built up over time. So that's a neat thing to think about, kind of today versus the deep time past. But today, with our acid oceans, having more broken up shell and changing the pH is especially important. So it's kind of a neat kind of story about how it's worked out for the best. So what can we ask about the past? And this is my friend, unfortunately, I don't have any front-on pictures. This is Nicole Smith, one of my main partners in crime in the archaeological record, Christine Roberts from Weweke First Nation, and Louis Wilson from Weweke. And all three of these folks have been there from ground zero, from the beginning, asking, you know, how can we ask these questions in the past? And I remember the first time when the first low tide, I said to Nicole, so should we dig into one? She goes, I guess we do. And it was very scary to move the first boulders, to try to get under the boulders to figure out how these things work. But now we kind of do it as a matter of course. So we can ask all the same ecological questions, but the first thing we need to know is how old are clam gardens? When do they show up in the paleoecological record? And then we can ask, what role did they play ecologically and culturally? So to answer those questions, we thought it would be easy. It wasn't easy. Very grateful to Hakai and the Tula Foundation for helping us submit multiple dates. We dug trenches into garden walls. And if you can see in this photo here in the red circle, you can see this clam that's trapped under the wall. So what we were looking for was clams that got trapped with the rolling of the rocks. So they were living on the beach surface, and then they got trapped, and then we could radiocarbon date it when the lights go out, when those clams die. Thinking that, then we could date the clam garden. When did the rocks basically smother that clam? The problem was, if you look here at these tests in the terrace, we found that if you dig low enough, you find tons of clams in the beach. Some of them, as you'll see, will date to 11,500 years ago, clearly not from the clam gardens. And so we were having to sort out clams that died in the moment from clams that have been there forever. And in places like Bella Bella and Heltzig territory, there are 10,000-year-old clams sitting on the surface. So if they're sitting on the surface today, they could have been sitting on the surface when people built walls and got trapped. So we had this very long and elaborate and fun journey, basically figuring out how to tell which of the clams are trapped, which of them are older, using sea level reconstruction, using depth positions, and a whole range of things. Also looking at barnacle scars that were on rocks. And we were able to figure out that clam gardens have very complex histories, but that they began building clam gardens at least 3,500 years ago and probably as old as 4,000 years ago, based on our data. Could be older. But you can see that these are all dates of when the walls were built. So you can see these walls are constantly being refurbished. So where you sample is going to really affect your understanding of how old they are. But we're pretty pleased with our 3,500 to 4,000-year-old date. And we feel pretty good about it because it fits with other places on the coast, we believe, and also fits with what we're seeing in the archaeological record. Evgeny, can you tell me what time we're at? Because I don't have a watch in front of me.
We're at 11:37.
Okay, cool. So I should wrap up quickly. Okay, So what influenced clam garden growth in the past and how productive were they? So what we did is we looked for clams, not just to date, but kind of below walls and below them to ask what was happening in the beaches below the clam gardens. So we dug under the walls, we dug in the terraces, and we dug in the middens. And we noticed, as you can see in the lower right, that there's a vast difference in size of butter clams depending on where we found them and when they date to. So we started measuring their age and size at death and looking at how quickly they grew, as you can see by looking at the growth rings here on the upper left and measuring them. And what we were able to do was basically collect clams, some on Clam Gardens, some in not, over a 11,500 year period. And we divided them up into 7 time periods that date before clam gardens were built, during clam garden use, and collecting clams from the middens, the archaeological sites, and then post-clam gardens in the early historic period and those that are living today, which allows us to look at 11,500 years of human-clam social-ecological systems. This is what the size looked at death. And you can see the 7th period is a box plot. You can see 11,000 years. They're very small, like the one here in this photo, and they get bigger through time. And then increasingly large through time, and then they get smaller in the late period. You can see that we're missing this period in the middle because this is when clams are found only in middens for us. They're not in the beaches, and we believe it's because there's so many people in the landscape that they're harvesting all the clams, so they're not in the beaches anymore. They're not dying in the beaches. So we had to turn to the middens for getting our age and size at death, but since people are harvesting them, they're landings data. We can't use the size as a measure of how long they could live. So to figure that out, we modeled von Bertalanffy curves, and BB curves are something that you fisheries people know well. That was news to me. And then we modeled the L-infinity. How big and old would they have been if they were left to live? And I acknowledge my daughter proudly, who did all the heavy hitting stats on this paper for us. So here in the VB curve, you can see that early in the Holocene, right after the Pleistocene, 11,500 years ago, and today, those today are growing, the clams are small, are growing very slowly. You can also see that early in the Holocene and the late Pleistocene, if they live to their full size, they are gonna always be small, and likewise, the ones that are living are small and the early historic period. So we see this trajectory through time of clams increasing through size after the Pleistocene, stabilizing in size, and then declining in size. So what does that mean? It means that people are doing some kind of management, I believe, in the form of clam gardens and other kinds of management techniques to be able to sustain the size of clams through time until something's happening here in the early historic period. I won't go into this in detail for time, but I just want to tell you to make the parallel for modern contexts is we found that our substrate, our temperatures and so on also are relevant, just like current conditions, and that sea surface temperatures are too hot or too cold would negatively affect growth, just like Anne's finding in her experiments. But we also found that it depended on age. So the smaller, younger ones were more affected negatively or positively by growth conditions. So this has been true for the last 11,500 years. And again, we don't have time to go over the graph, but just trust me that this is so. So how does this map onto how many people are on the landscape and what it looks like? These are dates from archaeological sites through time. So the oldest archaeological date in Quadra. And what you see is that there's a rapid expansion of settlements in time around 3,500 years ago. And that date will seem familiar to you. Then there's slower expansions of settlements, and then there's small settlements. And then the lights kind of go out in terms of settlements in this area because of introduced European diseases. So how does this map onto clam gardens? Perfectly. We see a lot of settlements at the exact same time. We see a lot of clam gardens being initiated. We see fewer settlements when clam gardens are expanding. We see ongoing use. And then we see a decline in mariculture when we have introduced diseases and settlers move into the region. So what does this mean? It means that there's this very intricate relationship between clam gardens, clams, and humans over time, where we had 11,500 years of people living sustainably, feeding a lot of people with clams, but you get this recent shift that I believe has to do with the decline in management practices, people being removed from the system, but also the introduction of logging and an introduction of fine silts. So we have a very dramatically shifted baseline where the clams today in the clam gardens that are looking more productive are actually much less productive. Look at that, those are clam garden clams. They're much less productive than the peak production in the past. So what role does this all have in kind of today's systems? As Skye, Augustine, and others, people in Metlakatla, in Swinomish, in Sechelt, all around the coast, First Nations are turning to clam gardens to kind of restore their connections and to the intertidal, or more actively to assert their connections. They never lost the connections, but really it's a place to restore connections to youth and to the land. And this is Skye's great work of reconstructing the clam gardens. It's amazing the work they're doing with the communities on the Gulf Islands National Park project with the Saanich and Hunkaminam communities here. This is my friend Ron Martin digging in a clam garden and just really talking about the reconnections. But again, it's happening up and down the coast. So it's highly relevant. It's also relevant in terms of larger issues of reconciliation. And we're seeing the clam garden issue being introduced into the schools. This is actually the curriculum for K9. Clam gardens are right there under stewardship as an example. And this example at the bottom is this beautiful book by Kay Weissman, illustrated by Roy Vickers with the help of many folks in the network, a kid's book on clam gardens. And I really think it's about getting to kids of all communities early to talk about that connection to place and why it's so important. And clam gardens are a perfect venue for doing that. So why, again, in a bigger picture, are we doing this, like beyond clam gardens, beyond BC? I think really these kinds of discussions are really important for larger global issues. I think they're important for recognizing these long-term connections and interconnections, and realizing that the past can really inform the present and the future. And we can learn much from the past about sustainable conservation strategies. I think we just need to stop and listen and be respectful to each other and to human and non-human beings. And that collectively will make for better science, and I believe more socially just science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was really great. You kicked us off the best way we can possibly imagine for the seminar series. So the way that we said that we would structure this Q&A period is to have people type their questions in the chat box. So whilst people are thinking about their questions and we put them forward, here is one that has just come forward. So you can both read the question, but I'm going to unmute Chloe and ask her to pose the question to you as well, Dana. So I just have to find Chloe, sorry.
Okay, sorry, I heard you. I'm just curious about that shift in clam size, either beforehand and after. I'm just wondering if the species composition of that clam bed landscape has changed with like competition, or just like changes in the relative, yeah, you know what I'm saying. As active management decreased, as community populations were decimated from disease, human community, would, yeah, that competition from other species have an effect on clam size? Have other species moved in and displaced access to whatever resources or something?
I can only kind of muse about it. We have very little information on other species in the past. When you dig into below the clam gardens, you get those ancient clam deposits, which by the way, were a complete surprise. I didn't know they existed. remember we were looking to date clam gardens. We weren't looking for 11,000 years of clam human relationships. So the clam gods gave that to us. But really, those death assemblages are dominated by butter clams, really, mostly, and then some little necks. So we don't, and we have very few other species, and we don't have a good enough sample of them to talk about switching, like if there's any kind of shift in abundance. And I would say today those species still dominate. Now, I think at a finer scale, almost certainly you're seeing there's going to be shifts in species abundance and relative abundance, I should say. Work by others on the team have showed that there's a whole, like, clam gardens are more diverse in terms of species. So having that reef there, that wall there, encourages a whole range of species. We see a lot of sea cucumbers, that's an obvious one, but there are other critters as well. So I suspect that the change in maintenance, the absence of tilling being a very big one, not removing predators, will definitely change species abundance. Now, I believe that that's a portion of Sky's amazing PhD thesis. So Sky, I don't know if you're still on, but Sky probably could speak to that. And as well, I think there was another question asking about the productivity, about the reconstructed clam gardens, which is definitely a goal.
Sure, thanks, Dana. I can just quickly speak to some of the restoration questions. One of the species that we've seen, a non-native species that is present on a lot of current day beaches, or some current day beaches, are varnish clams. And there are some early indications that varnish clams might be responding favorably to our beach tending practices. And so that's something that is currently kind of ongoing in restoration conversations right now. And yes, so most of the restoration projects also include monitoring to assess increases or shifts to various forms of both productivity, overall standing stock, and habitat condition. Thanks.
Thank you. We were going to go with Rowena next as a question, then Spencer, and then Andrea. So Rowena, you're up next.
Hi, thanks. I think Sky actually just answered my question in reference to whether or not there's monitoring, because I was thinking about changes in the forestry and how that might impact the current reestablishment, like you'd mentioned, of the clam gardens, or if considering climate change in that same context. But thanks, it was wonderful. And thanks for already answering my question.
So Spencer, please feel free to go ahead.
Thanks. I was wondering, is there such a thing as an oyster garden? Specifically, I'm thinking of Olympia oysters, and why or why not? I have some thoughts on that, but I'm sure you're the expert, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
When we started this, we kind of did a global search of mariculture, indigenous peoples around the world, and oysters is one of the things that were tended like by the Romans for a long time ago. We have very little information on oyster tending and sharing. Sky might be able to speak to this more. And it's in part because, of course, the introduced oyster has just kind of changed our beaches so dramatically. And the native oyster is, well, I think I've seen it once in all my time on the coast. It's very rare. But interestingly, in Slam, when I was living there, they had an oyster farm and they built themselves a clam garden, using their traditional knowledge to augment their modern mariculture of oyster. They say that that's exactly what they did, that they were motivated by clam gardens to do that. But in a traditional way, I like in the past is what I mean. I don't know of any instances, so I don't know if anybody else does who's online.
Thank you. Andrea, did you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dana. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. It was my first time, and you're a very engaging speaker. Thank you. I was just curious about just some of the outcomes from the interviews that have been led as part of this project and network, and if you could speak a bit more to the tenure systems in and around Quadra Island? Are they mostly held by specific families and lineages, and is that typically how they were carried through time? And I just wanted to add that in my nation, in the Nisga'a Nation, there's a really common saying. Everyone says that the tide's out and table's set, and I feel like that carries through all of your work. I really liked it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, totally. The tide is out. I just wish sometimes it would stay out a little longer so it wasn't so crazy. You know, Andrea, as an anthropologist and someone who gets to work with Indigenous communities, I think a lot about tenure in the past, and as a kind of conservation-minded person, tenure in the present. And so, but you know, the archaeological record is really tricky for getting at that, because, as you know, it's not always the places that are closest to home that you have the rights and responsibilities for tending. And that's an archaeological assumption, is that that is true. But if you talk to people, of course, their land might have been far away. So in Quadra, if you look at the record, we don't have any, no one has memory of this kind of knowledge about Quadra. But if you look at the record, there's major settlements at the heads of the inlets. And those places often don't have clam gardens associated with them. And then all the other places, these small nooks and crannies, have no settlements, no archaeological sites. So it means people were traveling from the settlement and bringing stuff back. So there's going to be some kind of really complex tenure system associated with that, which I fear we can no longer get at. And we've tried looking at, you know, kind of, you know, can we trace the clams and that kind of thing. One thing I can say is there's one settlement that has a clam garden in front of it. It's rare. In the one settlement that we had it, the clams that are right in front of that part of the beach are going back to that part of the midden, presumably that house. So it's like people are going right in front and taking it back, and I can tell by the measurements. So it's funny. So that might be a family portion of the beach, but I can't say for sure.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since we only have about 5 minutes left, we have time for one more question. Ira, or Ira, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you want to go next? And that will be then the last question before we wrap things up.
Sure. Thank you so much. It was a really, really interesting talk. I'm fascinated in kind of anything social-ecological in British Columbia, and especially research that gives us sort of the wide temporal picture, which this does. So that was extremely interesting. Yeah, so I don't know, my question's a little bit vague, I guess, but so the Clam Garden kind of seems like a win-win. It's marvelous on most accounts as far as I can tell. Just a really sort of hypothetical question is, I wonder if when all these clam gardens were established 4,000 years ago, if that may have also generated trade-offs with what the ecosystem was like before, or sort of like ecological biodiversity trade-offs, or trade-offs with other social uses of the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really astute question, and something that I wonder about. I think we can fall into the trap when we talk about past systems. We can idolize them. You know, people are people around the world, and that, you know, not all traditional management practices might have been good for biodiversity broadly. They're geared to augment culturally important species. So where there are microorganisms living on those bedrock shelves, they're now covered up. I wonder about that. We can never know. But, you know, these systems are geared toward, again, culturally relevant, culturally salient species. So I think there probably is a trade-off. In this case, I suspect that the bedrock shelves are kind of relatively devoid, and there's still a lot of bedrock shelves left. So I think it's probably a very healthy trade-off. And you know, in terms of the impact of people, the hungry species that we are, there's such a high density of people in this region, and we see no evidence archaeologically of any prey switching, reduction of size, reduction of numbers, nothing in the archaeological record. So it's consistent until indigenous people are removed. So it is kind of probably a win-win.
We have to unfortunately cut this fantastic discussion session short at this point. I'd like to thank very much Dinah for her fantastic and very engaging presentation on behalf of the IRF. And